The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and orange as Captain Sarah Martinez climbed into her A-10 Thunderbolt. She had done this same routine hundreds of times before. Check the instruments, test the radio, review the flight plan. But something felt different about today. Maybe it was the way the intelligence officer had avoided eye contact during the briefing. Maybe it was the unusual radio silence from command. Or maybe it was just another day in a war that had been going on for too long. Sarah had been flying the A-10 Warthog for 8 years. The other pilots called her Hawk because of her sharp eyes and deadly accuracy. She could spot enemy targets from miles away and hit them with precision that amazed even veteran ground controllers. The A-10 was not a beautiful aircraft like the sleek fighters that got all the attention. It was ugly and slow and built like a flying tank. But Sarah loved everything about it. The massive cannon that could destroy enemy vehicles with a single burst. The thick armor that could take incredible damage and keep flying. The twin engines that could run on almost any fuel and get her home even when everything else failed. Today she was flying patrol over the Korengal Valley. The locals called it the Valley of Death because so many soldiers had died fighting there over the years. The mountains rose up on all sides like the walls of a giant fortress. The Taliban knew every cave and every trail. They could appear without warning and disappear just as quickly. American forces had been fighting in this valley for years, but the enemy always seemed to know exactly where they were going. And when they would arrive, Sarah's radio was quiet as she flew her patrol route at 15,000 feet. The morning air was smooth and clear. She could see for miles in every direction. Small villages dotted the mountainsides like tiny toys. Narrow roads wound through the valleys like brown ribbons. It looked peaceful from up here, but Sarah knew that appearances could be deadly in Afghanistan. The enemy was always watching and always waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At exactly 9:30 in the morning, Sarah's world changed forever. Her radio exploded with urgent voices and the kind of panic that made experienced soldiers sound like frightened children. The call sign was Viper 6 and Sarah recognized the voice immediately. It was Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the officer in charge of special operations for the entire region. Sarah had never heard fear in his voice before, but she heard it now. Hawkeye 1. This is Viper 6. We have a code red situation in the Korengal Valley. SEAL Team Alpha is in deep trouble and they need immediate air support. How copy? Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Her hands moved over the controls without conscious thought as she banked her aircraft toward the emergency coordinates. Code red meant Americans were dying. It meant someone had made a terrible mistake and now brave soldiers were paying the price with their blood. Copy Viper 6. This is Hawkeye 1. I am 5 minutes out from the coordinates. What is the situation on the ground? The story that came through her headset was worse than her worst nightmares. SEAL Team Alpha had been sent on what intelligence called a routine extraction mission. A high-value Taliban commander was supposed to be hiding in a small compound in the valley. The SEALs were the best soldiers in the world at this kind of operation. They could get in and out without the enemy even knowing they had been there. But this time the intelligence had been completely wrong. The compound was not hiding one Taliban commander. It was the center of a massive trap that had been planned for weeks. More than 200 enemy fighters had been waiting in hidden positions all around the valley. They had heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades and mortars. They had positioned themselves on the high ground where they could shoot down into the valley like fish in a barrel. The 31 SEALs had rappelled from helicopters into what they thought was a secure landing zone. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by an army of enemies who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The helicopters had barely escaped, and now the SEALs were trapped on the valley floor with nowhere to run and no way to call for help except through their emergency radio. Sarah could hear the fear and desperation in the ground controller's voice as he explained the situation. The SEALs had taken cover behind some rocks in a bombed-out building, but their position was getting smaller by the minute. Enemy fire was coming from 3 different directions, and it was only a matter of time before the Taliban fighters worked up the courage for a final assault that would wipe out the entire team. Hawkeye 1, you are the only air support available in the area. The nearest attack helicopters are 40 minutes away, and these boys do not have 40 minutes. They are taking casualties and running low on ammunition. You are literally their only hope of getting out of this alive. Sarah looked down at her fuel gauge and weapons display. She had a full load of cannon ammunition and enough fuel for several hours of flight time, but she was just one pilot in one aircraft facing more than 200 enemy fighters who were dug in to perfect defensive positions. The odds were not just bad, they were impossible. As her A-10 approached the valley, Sarah could see the battle raging below. Muzzle flashes lit up the mountainsides like deadly fireworks. Smoke rose from multiple locations where mortars had exploded. Even from 15,000 feet, she could see that the SEALs were in serious trouble. They were completely surrounded and outnumbered by more than 6-1. The voice of the SEAL team leader came through on the emergency frequency. His call sign was Reaper 1, and Sarah could hear the sound of gunfire in the background as he spoke. His voice was calm and professional, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension of a man who knew he might be about to die. Hawkeye 1, this is Reaper 1. We are in a bad spot down here. We have enemy contact on 3 sides and they are closing in fast. We have taken 4 casualties and we are down to about 30% ammunition. Whatever you are planning to do, we need it now because we are not going to last much longer. Sarah took a deep breath and looked down at the valley one more time. 31 of America's finest soldiers were depending on her to save their lives. She was their only hope in a situation that seemed hopeless. The decisions she made in the next few minutes would determine whether these brave men went home to their families or became another tragic statistic in a war that had already claimed too many heroes. The mission had gone wrong in the worst possible way. Intelligence had failed. Communications had failed. The backup plan had failed. Now it was up to one pilot and one aircraft to somehow turn certain death into miraculous survival. Sarah Martinez had trained for this moment her entire career, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of responsibility she felt as she began her descent into the valley of death. Sarah pushed her A-10 Warthog into a steep banking turn as she approached the Korengal Valley. The massive twin engines roared behind her as she dropped from 15,000 feet to 10,000 feet. Every second counted now. 31 American warriors were fighting for their lives in the valley below, and she was their only lifeline. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. Her targeting system came alive with information as she got closer to the coordinates. The A-10 was equipped with the most advanced sensors and cameras available to the military. She could see heat signatures and movement patterns from miles away, but what she saw through her targeting pod made her stomach turn cold with fear and anger. The intelligence reports had been wrong about everything. This was not a small compound with a few guards. This was a massive military operation that had been planned for weeks or maybe even months. The Taliban had turned the entire valley into a killing field, designed specifically to trap American forces. Sarah could see enemy fighters positioned on 3 different ridge lines that surrounded the valley like the walls of a bowl. They had heavy machine guns mounted on tripods and rocket-propelled grenades stacked like firewood. Some positions had mortars that could drop explosive shells anywhere in the valley with deadly accuracy. The enemy fighters wore dark clothing that helped them blend into the rocky mountainsides. Many of them had been fighting in these mountains for years, and they knew every stone and every shadow. Through her targeting camera, Sarah counted at least 250 enemy fighters spread across the 3 ridge lines, but there were probably more hiding in caves and behind rocks that she could not see. The Taliban had positioned themselves perfectly to create overlapping fields of fire that covered every inch of the valley floor. Nothing could move down there without being hit by gunfire from multiple directions. In the center of this deadly trap were the 31 Navy SEALs of Team Alpha. Sarah could see them through her targeting system huddled behind whatever cover they could find. Some were behind large rocks that had fallen from the mountainsides. Others had taken shelter behind the walls of a bombed-out building that looked like it had been destroyed years ago in some previous battle. The SEALs were the best-trained soldiers in the world, but they were facing an impossible situation. They had been dropped into the center of the trap with no warning and no time to prepare. Their normal tactics depended on surprise and speed and overwhelming firepower, but now they were the ones who had been surprised, and they were outnumbered by more than 8-1. Sarah could see muzzle flashes winking like deadly stars all along the ridgelines as the Taliban fighters poured automatic weapons fire down into the valley. The sound of gunfire echoed off the mountain walls like thunder that never stopped. Every few seconds, a larger explosion would light up the valley floor as a mortar round or rocket-propelled grenade found its target. The SEAL positions were getting smaller by the minute. Sarah watched through her camera as enemy fire chipped away at the rocks they were hiding behind. The bombed-out building was taking hit after hit, and chunks of concrete were flying in all directions. It was only a matter of time before the Taliban fighters worked up enough courage to launch a final assault that would overrun the American positions, Sarah switched her radio to the emergency frequency and called down to the trapped SEALs. She needed to establish direct communication with the ground team so she could coordinate her attack runs without hitting friendly forces. Reaper 1, this is Hawkeye 1. I am overhead at your location and I can see your situation. I count approximately 250 enemy fighters in fortified positions on the ridgelines around you. Give me your exact position and mark it with infrared strobe so I can identify friendly forces. The voice that came back through her headset belonged to a man who was clearly under enormous stress but was still maintaining professional discipline. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was the senior enlisted man on the SEAL team, and he had been in combat for over 10 years. Sarah could hear automatic weapons fire in the background as he spoke. Hawkeye 1, this is Reaper 1. We are positioned approximately 400 meters north of the compound in a cluster of large rocks and a destroyed building. We have infrared strobes marking our perimeter, but be advised that enemy forces are within 50 meters of our positions on the east and south sides. We have taken 6 casualties so far with 2 KIA and 4 wounded. We are down to less than 40% ammunition and we cannot hold this position much longer. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. 2 SEALs were already dead and 4 more were wounded. These were not just statistics or numbers on a report. These were real people with families and friends back home who were waiting for them to return safely. The wounded men needed medical attention that they could not get while pinned down under enemy fire. Sarah looked at her weapons display and tried to calculate how she could help the trapped soldiers. Her A-10 carried a massive Gayu-8 Avenger cannon that could fire 30mm depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 4,000 rounds per minute. Each round was powerful enough to destroy an armored vehicle or penetrate thick concrete walls. But the problem was accuracy when friendly forces were so close to enemy positions. The A-10 also carried rockets and bombs, but those weapons had large blast radiuses that could kill friendly forces even if they missed their intended targets by a small margin. Sarah needed to find a way to attack the enemy positions without hitting the SEALs who were trapped in the middle of the battlefield. She began marking enemy positions on her targeting display. The Taliban fighters on the eastern ridgeline were the closest to the SEAL positions and represented the most immediate threat. They had at least 3 heavy machine gun positions and multiple rocket-propelled grenade teams. If she could silence those positions, it would give the SEALs some breathing room and maybe allow them to move to better cover. The northern ridgeline had the largest concentration of enemy fighters, including what looked like a mortar team that was dropping shells into the valley every few minutes. The western ridgeline appeared to have fewer fighters, but they were positioned to block any escape route from the valley. Sarah studied the terrain carefully through her targeting camera. The ridgelines were covered with loose rocks and boulders that would provide excellent cover for the enemy fighters. Many of them were positioned behind natural stone walls that would protect them from small arms fire. She would need to use her cannon with pinpoint accuracy to hit the enemy positions without causing rock slides that could bury the friendly forces below. The situation was getting worse by the minute. Sarah could see that the Taliban fighters were beginning to move closer to the SEAL positions. Groups of 3 or 4 fighters were advancing from rock to rock while their comrades provided covering fire. It was a classic infantry assault that would eventually overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. Reaper 1, this is Hawkeye 1. I can see enemy forces moving to assault positions. How much time do you think you have before they try to overrun your position? The answer came back immediately, and it was not what Sarah wanted to hear. Hawkeye 1, we estimate 10 to 15 minutes before they have enough fighters in position for a final assault. Our ammunition situation is critical, and we cannot maintain effective fire much longer. Whatever you are going to do, please do it fast because we are running out of options down here. Sarah took a deep breath and began planning her attack runs. She had less than 15 minutes to turn this hopeless situation around and save 31 American lives. Sarah stared at her radio display and felt the weight of an impossible decision crushing down on her shoulders. The rules of engagement were crystal clear, and she had memorized them years ago during her training. No pilot was allowed to conduct danger close fire missions without proper authorization from command. No pilot was allowed to engage enemy targets when friendly forces were within the minimum safe distance. No pilot was allowed to deviate from established attack procedures without direct orders from a superior officer. But 31 Navy SEALs were about to die, and she was the only person in the world who could save them. Sarah switched her radio to the command frequency and called back to her base. Major General Patricia Williams was the commanding officer for all air operations in the region, and she had a reputation for being tough but fair. Sarah had flown dozens of missions under her command and had never questioned an order. But today was different. Today she needed permission to break every rule in the book. Red Crown, this is Hawkeye 1 requesting immediate authorization for danger close fire missions in the Korengal Valley. I have 31 friendlies surrounded by estimated 250 enemy fighters. The situation is critical and backup is not available in time to prevent friendly casualties. The response came back within seconds, but it was not what Sarah wanted to hear. Major General Williams understood the situation, but her hands were tied by regulations that had been written by lawyers and politicians who had never been in combat. The rules existed for good reasons and exceptions could not be made even in desperate situations. Hawkeye 1, this is Red Crown. Negative on danger, close authorization. The minimum safe distance for 30mm cannon fire is 500 meters from friendly positions. Your reports indicate enemy forces within 50 meters of friendlies. Wait for backup units and maintain overwatch until further instructions. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge and calculated how long she could stay in the area. She had enough fuel for 3 more hours, but the SEALs did not have 3 more minutes. Through her targeting camera, she could see Taliban fighters moving closer to the American positions. Some of them were already within grenade-throwing distance of the rocks where the SEALs had taken cover. She switched back to the emergency frequency to get an update from the ground team. The voice that came through her headset was Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, but he sounded different now. The professional calm was still there, but underneath it, Sarah could hear the sound of a man who knew he was about to die. Hawkeye 1, this is Reaper 1. Enemy forces are within 30 meters of our positions on the east side. We can see them moving through the rocks and they are preparing for a final assault. We have no ammunition for our heavy weapons and we are down to individual rifle rounds. Request immediate air support or we are not going to make it. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and tried to think of alternatives. Maybe she could contact other units in the area. Maybe she could call for emergency helicopter extraction. Maybe she could create a diversion that would allow the SEALs to escape on foot. But every option she considered would take too much time and the SEALs did not have time. She opened her eyes and looked down at the valley again. Through her targeting system, she could see individual Taliban fighters crawling through the rocks like deadly insects. They were carrying assault rifles and rocket-propelled grenades, and they were getting ready to rush the American positions from 3 different directions at once. The SEAL team leader came on the radio again, and his voice was barely audible over the sound of gunfire that seemed to be getting closer and louder. The Taliban fighters were no longer trying to hide their movements, and Sarah could see dozens of them preparing for the final attack. Hawkeye 1. This is Reaper Actual. I am Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson, and I am in command of this unit. I want you to know that we understand your situation, and we do not want you to violate orders on our account, but I also want you to know that we are about to be overrun, and there is nothing we can do to stop it. We have done our best, but we are outnumbered and outgunned and out of options. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to the calm acceptance in the SEAL commander's voice. These men were prepared to die doing their duty, but they deserved better than this. They deserved to go home to their families. They deserved to see their children grow up and their wives grow old. They deserved to have someone fight for them the way they had fought for their country. The Taliban assault began exactly as Sarah had predicted. She watched through her targeting camera as more than 50 enemy fighters rose from their hiding places and began running toward the SEAL positions. They were firing their weapons as they ran, and Sarah could see rocket-propelled grenades streaking through the air toward the bombed-out building where some of the Americans had taken shelter. The SEALs returned fire with everything they had, but there were too many attackers coming from too many directions. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the American positions, but they were scattered and weak compared to the wall of fire coming from the attacking Taliban fighters. Red Crown, this is Hawkeye 1. The friendlies are under direct assault by approximately 50 enemy fighters. They cannot hold their positions without immediate air support. Request permission to engage with all available weapons. The response was immediate and final. Major General Williams had her orders and she could not change them no matter how much she might want to. The rules of engagement existed to prevent friendly fire incidents, and they could not be waived even to save American lives. Hawkeye 1. This is Red Crown. Negative on weapons engagement. Maintain overwatch and wait for backup units. ETA for attack helicopters is 35 minutes. Acknowledge orders and comply immediately. Sarah stared at her radio display and felt something break inside her chest. 35 minutes might as well have been 35 hours. In 35 minutes, there would be nothing left to rescue except bodies. The SEALs would be dead and the Taliban would disappear back into the mountains like ghosts. She switched to the emergency frequency one more time and heard the sound of close combat coming through her headset. The Taliban fighters had reached the SEAL positions, and the battle was now being fought with rifles and grenades at point-blank range. She could hear American voices shouting orders and warnings, but they were getting fainter and fewer. Lieutenant Commander Thompson came on the radio one last time. His voice was strained, and Sarah could hear explosions in the background as he spoke. The professional military bearing was still there, but she could also hear the desperation of a man watching his soldiers die around him. Hawkeye 1, this is Reaper Actual. They have breached our perimeter on the east side and we are fighting hand to hand. We have multiple casualties and we cannot hold much longer. I know you have your orders, but if there is anything you can do, please do it now because we are out of time. Sarah looked at her weapons controls and then at her radio display. She thought about her career and her family and her future. She thought about the oath she had taken to follow orders and obey the chain of command. She thought about the rules of engagement and the consequences of disobeying direct orders from a superior officer. Then she thought about 31 American warriors who were about to die because she was too afraid to break the rules. Sarah reached for her radio and switched to the emergency frequency. When she spoke, her voice was calm and determined, and filled with a resolve that surprised even her. All stations, this is Hawkeye 1. I am declaring a pilot emergency and engaging enemy targets with all available weapons. Orders be damned. Sarah pushed her A-10 Warthog into the steepest dive she had ever attempted in combat. The altimeter spun like a broken clock as she dropped from 10,000 feet toward the valley floor at a speed that made her ears pop and her vision blur around the edges. The twin engines screamed behind her as she dove toward the Taliban positions with the fury of an avenging angel. At 2,000 feet above the ground, she could see individual enemy fighters moving through the rocks toward the trapped SEALs. The Taliban assault was in full swing now, with dozens of fighters rushing the American positions from 3 different directions. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked through the air like deadly fireworks, and the sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the mountain walls like rolling thunder. Sarah pulled her aircraft level, at just 500 feet above the valley floor. At this altitude, she was well within range of every enemy weapon in the valley. Small arms fire could punch through her cockpit glass. Rocket-propelled grenades could blow her aircraft apart with a single hit. Even heavy machine guns could damage her engines or flight controls enough to bring her down. But she needed to be this low to make her shots count. The JAO-8 Avenger cannon mounted in the nose of her A-10 was the most powerful aircraft gun ever built. It fired 30mm depleted uranium rounds that could punch through tank armor like paper. But at high altitude, the rounds would spread out too much to be accurate when friendly forces were so close to the targets. Sarah activated her targeting system and began lining up her first attack run. The eastern ridgeline held the largest concentration of enemy fighters, and they were closest to the SEAL positions. She could see at least 40 Taliban fighters moving through the rocks with assault rifles and rocket launchers. Some of them had already reached the edge of the bombed-out building where several SEALs had taken cover. She switched her radio to the emergency frequency and called down to the trapped ground team. Her voice was calm and professional, despite the fact that she was about to risk everything on a series of attack runs that violated every safety protocol in the book. Reaper 1. This is Hawkeye 1, beginning my attack run from north to south along the eastern ridgeline. Mark your positions with infrared strobes and get your heads down. I am coming in danger close, and the margin for error is 0. The response came back immediately from Lieutenant Commander Thompson. Sarah could hear the relief in his voice even through the static and background noise of combat. The SEALs had been abandoned by their command structure and left to die, but now they had one pilot who was willing to risk everything to save their lives. Hawkeye 1. This is Reaper Actual. All positions marked with strobes. We are taking cover and waiting for your run. Godspeed, pilot. Sarah lined up her aircraft with the eastern ridgeline and put her finger on the trigger for the GAU-8 cannon. Through her targeting display, she could see Taliban fighters crouched behind rocks and natural stone walls. Many of them were firing down into the valley, at the SEAL positions, but some had spotted her aircraft and were turning their weapons toward the sky. She squeezed the trigger and felt the massive cannon come to life beneath her feet. The GAU-8 fired at a rate of 4,000 rounds per minute, and the sound was like the world being torn apart. Each 30-millimeter round weighed almost 2 pounds and traveled at 3,000 feet per second. When they hit their targets, the results were devastating. The eastern ridgeline exploded in a line of fire and smoke as Sarah's cannon rounds found their marks. Taliban fighters who had been hiding behind rocks simply disappeared in clouds of dust and debris. Others were thrown through the air like broken dolls as the massive rounds shattered the stone walls they had been using for cover. But the enemy was not helpless. As Sarah pulled up from her first attack run, every Taliban fighter in the valley turned their weapons toward her aircraft. The sky around her cockpit lit up with tracer rounds as dozens of assault rifles opened fire at once. She could hear the metallic pings of bullets striking her armored cockpit and feel the aircraft shudder as larger rounds found their mark. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past her left wing so close that she could feel the heat through the cockpit glass. Another one exploded just 50 feet behind her aircraft, close enough to rock the A-10 with its blast wave. Warning lights began flashing on her instrument panel as her aircraft systems registered the damage. Sarah banked hard to the right and began setting up for her second attack run. Through her targeting camera, she could see that her first pass had been devastatingly effective. At least 20 Taliban fighters were down and the survivors were scrambling for new cover. But there were still hundreds of enemy fighters in the valley, and they were all trying to kill her now. She lined up on a cluster of buildings on the northern ridgeline, where she had spotted a mortar team. The Taliban fighters had been dropping mortar rounds into the SEAL positions every few minutes, and eliminating them would give the ground team some breathing room. But as she began her dive toward the target, every enemy weapon in that area began tracking her aircraft. The second attack run was even more terrifying than the first. Sarah dove through a wall of small arms fire so thick that it looked like a deadly light show. Tracer rounds zipped past her cockpit in streams of red and orange light. Machine gun bullets drummed against her aircraft like deadly hail. She could smell smoke seeping into her cockpit through her oxygen mask. But she held her course steady and squeezed the trigger again. The GAU-8 cannon roared to life and sent another stream of depleted uranium rounds into the Taliban positions. The mortar team disappeared in a cloud of smoke and flying debris. Secondary explosions lit up the mountainside as her rounds hit stored ammunition and rocket-propelled grenades. Sarah pulled up hard from her second attack run and immediately began looking for her next target. Her aircraft was taking serious damage, but all the major systems were still functioning. The left engine was running rough and she could see warning lights for hydraulic pressure and fuel flow. But the A-10 had been designed to take punishment and keep flying. Through her targeting camera, she could see that the Taliban assault had stalled. The enemy fighters who had been rushing the SEAL positions were now diving for cover, as 30-millimeter cannon rounds tore apart their hiding places. The coordinated attack had dissolved into chaos as individual fighters tried to save themselves from the rain of death falling from the sky. But Sarah was not done yet. She could see more Taliban fighters moving up the valley from hidden positions. These were reinforcements who had been held in reserve for the final phase of the assault. If they reached the SEAL positions while her aircraft was damaged and low on ammunition, the Americans would still be overwhelmed. She banked her aircraft toward the western ridgeline where the reinforcements were advancing. Her cannon ammunition was getting low and her aircraft was flying like a wounded bird. But 31 American warriors were counting on her to keep fighting, and she would not let them down. The Taliban fighters on the western ridgeline had learned from watching her previous attack runs. As she began her dive toward their positions, they opened fire with everything they had. Heavy machine guns and assault rifles and rocket launchers all turned toward her aircraft at once. The sky exploded with enemy fire as Sarah flew straight into the teeth of their defenses. Heavy machine gun bullets shattered her cockpit glass and sent razor-sharp fragments flying around the inside of her aircraft. Another round punched through her left wing and severed a hydraulic line. Fluid sprayed across her cockpit window, making it almost impossible to see her targets, but Sarah pressed her attack with the determination of a warrior. Who knew that failure meant death for the men she was trying to save? She squeezed the trigger and watched her cannon rounds tear into the enemy positions like the hammer of an angry god. Taliban fighters were blown apart by the massive 30mm rounds. Others were buried under avalanches of rock and debris as the canyon walls collapsed around them. When she pulled up from her third attack run, Sarah's aircraft was barely flying. Warning alarms filled her cockpit and she could smell electrical fires burning somewhere behind her seat. But through her targeting camera she could see that the Taliban assault had been completely broken. Enemy fighters were running in all directions trying to escape the devastation she had brought down on their heads. The 31 Navy SEALs were still alive, and the immediate threat had been eliminated. But Sarah knew that her fight was just beginning. Sarah's A-10 Warthog limped through the sky above the Korangal Valley like a wounded eagle that refused to die. Smoke trailed from her left engine in a dark ribbon that marked her position for every enemy fighter below. Warning lights flashed across her instrument panel like a deadly Christmas display. The smell of burning electrical components filled her cockpit despite her oxygen mask. But she was still flying and the SEALs were still alive, and that was all that mattered. Through her damaged cockpit glass, Sarah could see the results of her attack runs scattered across the valley floor. Taliban bodies lay among the rocks where her 30mm cannon rounds had found them. Destroyed weapons and equipment were scattered like broken toys across the mountainsides. Smoke rose from dozens of impact points where her depleted uranium rounds had shattered stone and flesh with equal ease. But the enemy was far from defeated. Sarah's targeting system showed movement all across the valley as surviving Taliban fighters regrouped and took new positions. They had learned that her aircraft was vulnerable, and they were adapting their tactics accordingly. Instead of staying in large groups, they were spreading out and using smaller positions that would be harder for her to hit. Her radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the command center back at base. Major General Williams had been monitoring the engagement, and she was not happy about Sarah's decision to disobey direct orders. The tone in her voice was ice cold and filled with the kind of anger that could end military careers with a single word. Hawkeye 1. This is Red Crown. You are ordered to disengage immediately and return to base. Your aircraft is severely damaged and you are in violation of direct orders regarding danger close engagements. Acknowledge immediately and comply with RTB orders. Sarah looked down at the SEAL positions through her targeting camera. The American soldiers were still pinned down behind their makeshift cover, but the immediate assault had been broken. Dead and wounded Taliban fighters were scattered around their perimeter, like a gruesome reminder of the price of attacking United States forces. But she could also see fresh enemy movement on the ridgelines as reinforcements moved into position. She switched her radio back to the emergency frequency and called down to Lieutenant Commander Thompson. She needed to know how much time the SEALs had before the Taliban could mount another coordinated assault. Her aircraft was dying around her, but she might have enough fight left to make a difference. Reaper. Actual, this is Hawkeye 1. What is your current status down there? I can see enemy movement on all ridgelines, but the immediate threat appears to have been neutralized. The response came back quickly, and it carried both relief and concern. The SEAL commander was grateful for what Sarah had already accomplished, but he could see that her aircraft was in serious trouble. Smoke was pouring from her engines and her flight pattern showed clear signs of control problems. Hawkeye 1, this is Reaper Actual. Your attack runs have broken their assault and bought us some breathing room. We have consolidated our positions and treated our wounded, but we can see enemy reinforcements moving up the valley from the west. We estimate another 100 fighters approaching our location. Your aircraft appears to be heavily damaged, and we do not want you to risk your life further on our account. Sarah checked her fuel gauge and weapons display. She had burned through most of her cannon ammunition during the attack runs, and her fuel was running dangerously low. The left engine was barely functioning and hydraulic fluid was leaking from multiple punctures in her wing. But her targeting system was still working, and she still had rockets mounted under her wings. More importantly, she could see exactly what Lieutenant Commander Thompson was talking about. A long column of Taliban fighters was moving up the narrow valley road like a deadly parade. They had trucks loaded with heavy weapons and ammunition. Some vehicles carried what looked like anti-aircraft missiles that could shoot down her damaged aircraft with ease. Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed. Her aircraft might not survive another series of attack runs, but Those 100 fresh enemy fighters would overwhelm the SEALs if they reached the valley floor. She had come this far and sacrificed this much to save American lives. She would not stop now when the mission was only half complete. She switched her radio back to the command frequency and spoke with a calm determination that surprised even her. Major General Williams would probably court-martial her when she got back to base, but that was a problem for tomorrow. Today she had a job to finish. Red Crown, this is Hawkeye 1. I have eyes on approximately 100 enemy reinforcements moving up the valley road. They have heavy weapons and anti-aircraft systems that will threaten any rescue helicopters. I am engaging with remaining ordnance and will continue until the threat is neutralized, or my aircraft is no longer capable of flight. The response was immediate and filled with barely controlled fury. Major General Williams was a career officer who had worked her way up through the ranks by following orders and expecting others to do the same. Sarah's continued disobedience was a direct challenge to military discipline and chain of command. Hawkeye 1. You are ordered to disengage immediately. Your aircraft is not capable of sustained combat operations, and you are placing yourself at unnecessary risk. Return to base immediately or face court-martial proceedings. Sarah switched off her command radio and focused all her attention on the enemy convoy moving up the valley road. The Taliban fighters had spread their vehicles out to minimize damage from air attacks, but they were still vulnerable on the narrow mountain road. She had enough rockets left to make a significant impact if she could get close enough to use them effectively. But getting close meant flying directly into the teeth of their anti-aircraft defenses. Sarah could see heavy machine guns mounted on several trucks and what looked like shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles being prepared by teams of fighters. They knew she was coming, and they would be ready for her. Sarah began her descent toward the convoy with the grim determination of a pilot who knew she might not survive the next few minutes. Her left engine was smoking badly and making noises that suggested it could fail at any moment. Her hydraulics were barely functioning, and she could feel the aircraft getting harder to control with each passing second. At 3,000 feet above the convoy, every anti-aircraft weapon opened fire at once. The sky around her cockpit exploded with tracer rounds and surface-to-air missiles. Sarah jinked left and right, trying to avoid the incoming fire, but her damaged aircraft responded slowly to her control inputs. A heavy machine gun burst stitched across her right wing, and she felt the aircraft lurch sideways as hydraulic lines were severed. Another burst shattered what remained of her cockpit glass and sent fragments flying around the inside of her aircraft. She could taste blood in her mouth where a piece of glass had cut her lip. But she held her course and launched her first pair of rockets at the lead vehicle in the convoy. The Hydra rocket streaked down from the sky like arrows of fire and struck the truck with devastating effect. The vehicle exploded in a ball of flame that lit up the entire valley and sent debris flying in all directions. Sarah pulled up hard and began setting up for another attack run. Her aircraft was shaking like it was about to come apart, and warning alarms were screaming in her ears. But the convoy was stalled on the narrow road with burning wreckage blocking their advance. She had them exactly where she wanted them. The second attack run was even more dangerous than the first. The Taliban fighters had abandoned their vehicles and taken cover among the rocks beside the road. They were firing everything they had at her damaged aircraft as she dove toward them through a storm of bullets and missile trails. Sarah launched her remaining rockets in rapid succession and watched them tear into the scattered vehicles like the fist of an angry god. Trucks exploded and burned. Ammunition supplies detonated in secondary explosions that echoed off the mountain walls. Taliban fighters ran in all directions trying to escape the carnage. When she pulled up from her final attack run, Sarah's aircraft was barely capable of controlled flight. The left engine had failed completely and was trailing black smoke. The right engine was running rough and losing power. Her flight controls were responding sluggishly, and she could see fuel leaking from multiple holes in her wings. But through her targeting camera, she could see that the enemy convoy had been completely destroyed. Burning vehicles littered the valley road, and the surviving Taliban fighters were scattered and disorganized. The immediate threat to the SEAL team had been eliminated once again. Sarah tried to contact the SEALs on her emergency radio, but got only static in response. Her communications equipment had been damaged during the last attack run, and she had no way to coordinate with the ground team. She was flying a dying aircraft over hostile territory, with no way to call for help and no guarantee that she could make it back to base. But 31 American warriors were alive because of what she had accomplished today, and that made everything worthwhile. Sarah's A-10 Warthog struggled through the air like a wounded bird trying to stay airborne through sheer willpower. The left engine was completely dead and hanging from its mount like a broken wing. The right engine coughed and sputtered as it tried to keep the heavy aircraft flying on half power. Black smoke poured from multiple holes in her wings where enemy bullets had punctured fuel lines and hydraulic systems. Her instrument panel looked like a Christmas tree of failure, with every warning light flashing red or amber. The master caution alarm had been screaming for so long that Sarah had stopped hearing it. Oil pressure was dropping on the remaining engine. Hydraulic pressure was almost zero. Fuel was leaking faster than she was burning it. By every measure that mattered, her aircraft should have fallen out of the sky 10 minutes ago. But the A-10 Thunderbolt had been designed by engineers who understood that sometimes pilots needed to keep flying when everything else said they should quit. The aircraft had redundant systems and backup controls and armor plating thick enough to stop small cannon rounds. It was built to take incredible punishment and bring its pilot home alive. Sarah banked her dying aircraft around the valley one more time to assess the situation on the ground. Through her damaged targeting camera, she could see the SEAL positions clearly marked by infrared strobes. The American soldiers had used the breathing room from her attacks to consolidate their defenses and treat their wounded. But they were still trapped in the valley with no way to escape on foot. The Taliban forces that remained in the area were scattered and disorganized, but they were far from defeated. Sarah counted at least 50 enemy fighters still moving among the rocks and caves on the ridgelines. They had learned to stay spread out and use small groups that would be harder for her to target. More importantly, they seemed to be waiting for something. Sarah got her answer when her damaged radio crackled to life with an urgent transmission from an intelligence aircraft orbiting high above the valley. The news was worse than anything she could have imagined, and it changed everything about the tactical situation on the ground. Hawkeye 1, this is Overwatch 7. We have multiple vehicles approaching your location from the north. Count appears to be 15 to 20 trucks carrying an estimated 200 additional enemy fighters. ETA to your location is 8 minutes. Advise your status and intentions. Sarah stared at her fuel gauge and tried to calculate whether she had enough time and ammunition to make a difference. Her cannon was empty, and she had used all her rockets during the convoy attack. The only weapons she had left were 2 500-pound bombs mounted under her wings. But dropping bombs that close to friendly forces would be suicide for the SEALs she was trying to save. She switched her radio to the emergency frequency and tried to contact the SEAL team on the ground. Her communications equipment was badly damaged, and she could only hear static mixed with fragments of voices. But after several attempts, she managed to establish contact with Lieutenant Commander Thompson. Reaper, actual, this is Hawkeye 1. I have reports of 200 additional enemy fighters approaching from the north in vehicles. ETA 8 minutes. My aircraft is severely damaged, and I am out of cannon ammunition and rockets. I have 2 500-pound bombs remaining, but cannot use them. Danger close to your positions. The response came back broken and filled with static, but Sarah could hear the resignation in the SEAL commander's voice. Thompson was a professional soldier who understood the reality of their situation. 200 fresh enemy fighters would overwhelm his wounded and ammunition-depleted team within minutes of their arrival. Hawkeye 1, this is Reaper actual. We copy the threat assessment. We have consolidated our wounded and prepared defensive positions, but we cannot hold against those numbers with our current ammunition status. We appreciate everything you have done for us today. You have given us more time than we had any right to expect. Sarah looked down at the valley one more time and tried to think of alternatives. The rescue helicopters were still 20 minutes away, and the new enemy force would arrive in less than 8 minutes. Even if she could somehow delay their arrival, the SEALs would still be outnumbered by more than 6 to 1 when the final battle began. Then she saw something that made her blood run cold. Through her targeting camera, she could see the approaching convoy spread out across the mountain road like a deadly parade. But these were not the same kind of pickup trucks and captured military vehicles that the Taliban usually used. These were modern military trucks with heavy armor and mounted weapon systems. Some of them appeared to be carrying anti-aircraft missiles that could shoot down the rescue helicopters before they could reach the valley. Sarah realized that this was not a rescue mission anymore. This was a trap within a trap. The original ambush had been designed to capture or kill a SEAL team, But this second force was meant to destroy any aircraft that came to help them. The Taliban had planned this operation for weeks, and they were prepared for every contingency, including air support. She switched her radio back to the intelligence aircraft and requested more detailed information about the approaching convoy. What she heard confirmed her worst fears and forced her to make the most difficult decision of her military career. Overwatch 7. This is Hawkeye 1. Can you identify the vehicle types in that convoy? I need to know what kind of weapon systems they are carrying. The response came back immediately, and it was exactly what Sarah had expected to hear. The Taliban had not just sent reinforcements to overrun the SEAL positions. They had sent a mobile anti-aircraft unit specifically designed to shoot down American rescue helicopters and close air support aircraft. Hawkeye 1. This is Overwatch 7. We identify multiple SA-7 and SA-14 surface-to-air missile systems in that convoy, along with ZU-23 anti-aircraft guns. This appears to be a deliberate anti-air ambush designed to target rescue operations. Any helicopters approaching that valley will be destroyed before they can reach the landing zone. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to process what she had just learned. The rescue helicopters carrying medical teams and additional troops were flying directly into a death trap. The Taliban had positioned themselves perfectly to destroy any aircraft that tried to help the trapped SEALs. Unless someone could eliminate those anti-aircraft weapons, the rescue mission would fail, and everyone would die. She looked at her weapons display one more time. 2 500-pound bombs were not much against 200 enemy fighters, but they might be enough to destroy the anti-aircraft systems if she could get close enough to place them accurately. The problem was that using those bombs would require her to fly directly over the convoy at low altitude where every weapon could target her damaged aircraft. Sarah made her decision with the calm acceptance of a warrior who understood that some battles could only be won through sacrifice. She had already violated every order and broken every rule to save the SEALs. Now she would have to risk everything. One more time to make sure they could be rescued safely. Switched her radio to the command frequency and spoke with a voice that was steady and determined despite the impossible odds she was facing. Major General Williams would probably never forgive her for what she was about to do, but the lives of 31 American warriors were worth more than her military career. Red Crown. This is Hawkeye 1. I am engaging the approaching convoy with remaining ordnance to eliminate anti-aircraft threats to rescue operations. My aircraft is severely damaged and may not survive the attack run, but the mission requires elimination of enemy air defenses. The response was immediate and filled with a mixture of anger and concern. Major General Williams understood the tactical situation, but she also knew that Sarah was essentially volunteering for a suicide mission. A damaged A-10 had almost no chance of surviving a direct attack on a convoy equipped with modern anti-aircraft weapons. Hawkeye 1. This is Red Crown. Negative on attack authorization. Your aircraft is not capable of sustained combat and the risk assessment is unacceptable. Disengage immediately and wait for backup units to handle the convoy. Sarah switched off her command radio for the final time and began her descent toward the approaching Taliban convoy. There would be no backup units and no second chances. The rescue helicopters were already en route and they could not be warned about the anti-aircraft trap waiting for them. Someone had to clear the way, and she was the only pilot in position to do it. Her damaged A-10 shook and groaned as she pushed it into a steep diving attack that would take her directly over the enemy convoy at minimum altitude. Every warning alarm in her cockpit was screaming, and she could see pieces of her aircraft breaking away in the slipstream. But she held her course steady and prepared to drop her bombs with the precision of a surgeon and the courage of a hero. The final battle was about to begin, and Sarah Martinez was ready to give everything she had to save American lives. Sarah pushed her dying A-10 Warthog into the steepest dive of her military career as she screamed down toward the Taliban convoy like a meteor falling from heaven. The altimeter spun wildly as she dropped from 8,000 feet to just above the mountain peaks in less than 30 seconds. Her remaining engine was running so rough that the entire aircraft shook like it was about to come apart in midair. Through her shattered cockpit glass, she could see the enemy convoy spread out along the narrow mountain road like a deadly snake. 20 military trucks carried surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns that could destroy the incoming rescue helicopters with ease. Sarah counted at least 200 Taliban fighters manning the weapon systems and preparing to spring their trap on the unsuspecting American aircraft. But they had not expected a half-dead A-10 to come diving out of the sky with 500-pound bombs and a pilot who had nothing left to lose. Sarah lined up her aircraft with the center of the convoy where the largest concentration of anti-aircraft weapons was positioned. She had 2 bombs remaining, and she would get exactly 1 chance to place them where they could do the most damage. Miss the target and the rescue helicopters would fly into a death trap. Hit the target and she might just save everyone. Every anti-aircraft weapon in the convoy opened fire at once as Sarah's A-10 came screaming down from the sky. Surface-to-air missiles streaked upward, leaving trails of white smoke. Heavy machine guns and automatic cannons filled the air with tracer rounds that looked like deadly fireworks. The Taliban fighters knew that this was their chance to destroy the aircraft that had been hunting them all morning. A A-7 missile exploded just 50 feet from Sarah's left wing, and the blast wave nearly flipped her aircraft upside down. Shrapnel from the warhead punched hundreds of holes through her wing and fuselage. Another missile detonated directly behind her, and the concussion shattered every instrument in her cockpit. Warning alarms that had been screaming for the past hour suddenly went silent as electrical systems failed throughout the aircraft. Sarah could taste blood in her mouth and feel warm liquid running down her face where flying glass had cut her forehead. Her vision was blurred and her ears were ringing from the explosions. But her hands were steady on the bomb release controls, and her targeting computer was still functioning despite the damage. At just 500 feet above the convoy, Sarah released both 500-pound bombs in rapid succession. The weapons fell away from her aircraft like deadly raindrops and streaked down toward the center of the Taliban formation. She pulled up as hard as her damaged flight controls would allow and prayed that her bombs would find their targets. The first explosion lit up the entire valley like a miniature sun as the bomb detonated directly on top of a truck carrying surface-to-air missiles. The secondary explosions from the destroyed missiles created a chain reaction that spread through the convoy like wildfire. Vehicle after vehicle erupted in balls of flame as ammunition and fuel supplies were ignited by the spreading fires. The second bomb hit a cluster of anti-aircraft guns, and the explosion sent metal fragments flying in all directions like deadly confetti. Taliban fighters who had been manning the weapons disappeared in clouds of smoke and debris. Others were thrown through the air like broken dolls as the massive explosion tore through their positions. Sarah fought to control her aircraft as it climbed away from the devastation below. Her right engine was making noises that suggested it could fail at any moment. Hydraulic fluid was spraying across her cockpit windows, making it almost impossible to see. But through the smoke and fire, she could see that her attack had been successful. The Taliban convoy was completely destroyed. Burning vehicles littered the mountain road, and secondary explosions continued to rock the valley as ammunition supplies detonated. The anti-aircraft weapons that had threatened the rescue helicopters were nothing but twisted metal and smoking debris. Sarah tried to contact the rescue helicopters on her emergency radio, but her communications equipment had been destroyed during the missile attack. She could only hope that the helicopter pilots would see the smoke and fire and understand that the threat had been eliminated. The rescue mission could proceed, and the 31 trapped SEALs would finally be saved. But Sarah's own situation was becoming desperate. Her aircraft was losing altitude despite her best efforts to maintain level flight. The right engine was running on fumes and making sounds that meant it could quit at any moment. Her flight controls were barely responding, and she could feel the aircraft getting heavier as fuel continued to leak from damaged tanks. She looked at her navigation display and calculated the distance to the nearest friendly airfield. Bagram Airbase was 60 miles to the east, but she was not sure her aircraft could make it that far. The smaller forward operating base at Salerno was only 30 miles away, but the runway there was short and surrounded by mountains that would make an emergency landing extremely dangerous. Sarah made her choice and turned her dying aircraft toward Salerno. She had come this far and accomplished this much. She was not going to give up now and let the Taliban have the satisfaction of shooting down an American pilot. If her aircraft was going to crash, she would at least try to crash it on friendly territory. Behind her, the rescue helicopters were finally approaching the valley, where the SEALs had been trapped for more than 4 hours. The pilots could see the burning wreckage of the Taliban convoy, and the smoke rising from Sarah's attack runs. They knew that one brave pilot had cleared the way for their mission and made their rescue possible. Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson was waiting with his surviving SEALs as the first helicopter touched down in the valley. All 31 American warriors were alive, though several were badly wounded. They had been surrounded and outnumbered and abandoned by their command structure. But one A-10 pilot had refused to leave them behind and had fought impossible odds to keep them alive. Thompson looked up at the sky where he could see Sarah's damaged aircraft limping toward the horizon, trailing smoke and debris. He grabbed his radio and tried to contact the pilot who had saved his team but got only static in response. All he could do was watch as the A-10 disappeared over the mountains and hope that the hero who had saved their lives would make it home safely. Sarah's aircraft barely made it to Salerno before the right engine finally quit completely. She glided, the dead A-10 toward the runway with no power and almost no hydraulic pressure. The landing was more like a controlled crash as the heavy aircraft hit the runway hard and skidded for almost 1,000 feet before finally coming to a stop. When the crash crews reached her aircraft, they found Sarah unconscious in her cockpit, with blood on her face and her flight suit torn by shrapnel. But she was alive and breathing, and the medics quickly determined that her injuries were not life-threatening. She had survived one of the most dangerous missions in the history of combat aviation. The official report would state that Captain Sarah Martinez had single-handedly destroyed more than 400 enemy fighters and eliminated a major anti-aircraft threat to rescue operations. She had violated direct orders and broken multiple regulations, but her actions had saved 31 American lives and prevented the loss of several rescue helicopters. Sarah would later receive the Medal of Honor for her actions that day. But she always insisted that she was just doing her job and following the warrior code that said no American soldier would ever be left behind. The 31 SEALs went home to their families, and Sarah went back to flying missions in a new A-10 that she hoped would never have to prove itself the way her old one did. In the brotherhood of warriors, stories like this become legend. They are told and retold around campfires and in ready rooms where brave men and women prepare to risk everything for their country. They remind everyone that sometimes when all hope is lost and the odds are impossible, one person with enough courage can change the course of history. Sarah Martinez had faced the ultimate test of a warrior, and she had not been found wanting. She had looked death in the face and refused to blink. She had chosen duty over safety and honor over survival. She had proven that heroes are not born. They are made in moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. The 31 SEALs never forgot the pilot who saved their lives, and Sarah never forgot the responsibility she felt for bringing them home safely. In a war filled with tragedy and loss, their story became a beacon of hope that reminded everyone why the fight was worth fighting and why some things are worth any sacrifice.